You are signed in to the webinar sponsored by the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association on Building Back Smarter. I'm French Wetmore. I'm going to do most of the talking. Alessandra Girolaman is our executive director, and she's doing most of the controlling in the background. She will be checking on questions, and if you have any concerns, your webinar screen should have an email address that you can send to her. Any questions? You know the call-in number and the code. On webinars, there's often a problem with background noise, people talking in your room, or fire sirens going on. We'd ask if you mute your phones. If your phone doesn't have a mute feature, if you hit *6, that will mute your phone so we can't hear you, and then if you want to ask a question, *6 will unmute it. If you are a certified floodplain manager, you can get 1 continuing education credit if you stay through the whole webinar. If you are interested in that, send an email to the NHMA address, and we'll include you in a master list that we'll send to the Association of State Floodplain Managers to get your credit in the record. I would like to also thank at this time Don Watson, who helped us with the first draft of this PowerPoint. If you have questions, given the number of people on the call, we'd like to try the webinar tool for questions. And you can see the instructions here. If you haven't done GoToWebinar, just enter in your questions. Alessandra will be monitoring the questions, and we'll bring them up at the appropriate time. And then at the end of the presentation, we can talk and answer questions for as long as we need to. So let's get into what happens after a disaster. You've got residents in your community. They are walking back to their homes and looking at this mess and the damage and destruction, and they're hit pretty hard. They are not in the strongest shape because of what they've been through, and they need help. They are not in the best financial shape because they've just suffered a big loss. They will try to do as much as they can on their own. Whether they know what they're doing is a different question. But they are needing help. And one of the things, I'm sure if you're a local official, you've already found out that they have a tendency to blame their local government, state government, federal government, for making things worse or for being part of the problem. And so you, as a local official, are probably already on the defensive, needing to help these people, but they're already upset about what happened to them, and they're upset about what the government did or did not do. And one thing they really want to do is get back to normal. For them, normal is the pre-disaster situation. It was a much better situation than they have now. They may have very fond, if not accurate, memories of what life was like, but they really want to get back to normal. And the problem, of course, is getting back to normal means they're exposed to getting damaged by the same hazard. So this is not what you want to see again and again and again, and it will happen again and again and again unless you do something about it. And nobody really wants it to happen. So what we're promoting is something that we're certainly not alone in saying, and that is you have an opportunity to get a new message out. Instead of saying to your residents, we want to get you back to normal as fast as possible, you want to say, wait a minute, we want to build back better. We want to build back smarter. And this message has echoed around the area recently hit by Superstorm Sandy. Particularly, it was great to hear Mayor Bloomberg of New York City use these very same words. So what the Natural Hazards Mitigation Association has is a 4-page paper with 9 steps to identify how you can organize your activities to build back smarter. That is on our website. In fact, the website has the paper plus additional information, and at this stage, we'd recommend you really work off the website and not the paper, because the website has lots of links to where you can get help. And also at the website, there is a 1-pager for your decision makers that summarizes what this is all about in a shorter and sweeter presentation. The key thing about the message is that communities that have stopped and thought about things before they automatically try to go back to normal are now better off. And the key message that you want folks to say is this is it. Stop and think. Don't automatically say, let's go back to the way we were before, because the way you were before means you're going to get flooded or hit by the same kind of disaster again in the future. And stop and think is really a kind of a layperson's term for plan. Let's not automatically return. Let's stop. Let's think about what we want to do better. Let's make some plans, and let's carry them out. Folks need to be convinced that it will happen again, and it may even happen worse next time. And I'm thinking in particular in the Hurricane Sandy area that that message is getting out really well. Have a plan before you rush to rebuild. Take these opportunities to mitigate. And mitigate means get better protected from this kind of disaster and other hazards too. So the 9 steps that we propose in this paper and that I'll be reviewing with you are simply kind of like a laundry list of things to do. They are not necessarily needed to be followed in order. They are good thoughts, and a lot of them can be done concurrently. So don't just start one and not look at the rest, but take a look at the whole thing and see how much you could be doing all at the same time. So step 1, so we're going to go through these one by one. Make sure you know the rules, and make sure your decision makers know the rules. Most every community anymore has a building code that has standards for repairs and reconstruction. If it's a floodplain problem, and that's what most of this will focus on, particularly because of Sandy, you need to know the National Flood Insurance Program's floodplain management rules. And there's one big rule that will impact every community that's in the program, and that's that if you have a building that's in the special flood hazard area, which is the floodplain mapped on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, if that building is damaged, and it really doesn't matter if it was damaged by flood or fire or wind or a truck running into it, but the cost to repair that damage is greater than or equal to 50% of the value of the building before the damage, then that building is a substantially damaged building. And that phrase, substantially damaged, probably is echoed throughout communities that have been hit by disasters. A substantially damaged building has to be treated as a new building. So you must repair or rebuild a substantially damaged building to meet all the standards of a new building in the floodplain. What does that mean? At a minimum, that means as a community, you're going to have to take a look at all the damaged buildings to determine if they're in the floodplain and if they were substantially damaged. That gives you time to stop and think. When you tell the people, listen, we have a law we have to follow. You can't do repairs until we make a substantial damage determination. Stop and think. You're going to have to wait a little bit till we can get to your house, and let's think about alternatives to automatically repairing the way you were before. And if you're substantially damaged, you cannot repair the way you were before. So we know at a minimum there will be some mitigation. A house sitting 4 feet below the flood level will have to be elevated above the flood level. Whether that's enough or not is what we want you to stop and think about. So on our website, we have each of the rules identified and summarized from the paper, but we also have sections on resources and some comments. And in the shaded box, we have a section on Conway, South Carolina. This is a community we worked with a few years ago that got hit by Hurricane Floyd and followed these steps. They weren't called it at the time, but they did a very similar kind of operation. So we've got some real-life examples for you. And one of those is a resolution that the community passed to tell folks that at a minimum we know we've got an ordinance we have to force, and it is the policy of the city to, above all, stay in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program. The city fathers said, we are not going to try to beat the rules. We're not going to try to get around the rules. We need the National Flood Insurance Program. We need disaster assistance. And so you can expect us to enforce the rules. A very good message to get out to folks. It reassures them that the city fathers are behind the enforcement of the rules because they're good rules to follow. Step 2. The problem with the rules is that they were written a few years ago based on older flood data, And so right away you ought to be thinking about higher standards, not the minimum rules from the National Flood Insurance Program. The substantially damaged building has to meet the rules that are on your books, but think about those rules. Are they good enough? Okay, so I hear a phone ringing in the background. That's why we'd like folks to mute their phones if they would.
That's me. Hello?
So think about the fact that the world is changing. We're talking about more rain coming along. We're talking about sea level rise. We're talking about climate change. So if your rules are based on a 5, 10, 15-year-old flood insurance study, and you tell people they have to be built to the flood level according to this old study, is that good enough? You can expect most new studies are coming out with higher flood hazards. So think about the study level. Think about other standards that you could be incorporating right now. As long as you're going to rebuild a building, if it's going to have to be elevated, why not elevate it even higher to be better protection? So we got a few examples for you. The first one that is very hot topic, as I understand it, in the Hurricane Sandy area is advisory flood elevations. These are maps FEMA has issued for the New Jersey and New York coasts that say our flood studies you have been using for the past few years are not accurately reflecting the true hazard. We've recalculated the hazard, and it is higher. The V zone is bigger than you thought, and these have come out recently. There's some explanatory materials on it on FEMA's websites, and our website that I mentioned earlier that has the 9 steps on it are either now or will soon have links to these information on the ABFEs, or advisory-based flood elevations. So think seriously about adopting these. Why protect somebody from last year's hazard when next year's flood is going to be higher? Another thing to consider is freeboard. Freeboard says don't just build to the minimum level, but add a foot or 2 or 3, go higher, and not only will your building be better protected, but your flood insurance rates will be greatly reduced. And flood insurance rates are expected to increase over the next few years because of a thing called the Biggert Waters Act that is Congress is telling the flood insurance program you got to start paying for yourself, and that means raising rates. So people's rates are going to go up. The best way to counteract increased rates is to improve the protection of the building, get it higher, and you can actually pay lower rates than people are paying now. Think about when you elevate a building, keeping that lower area open so if water can go through. Don't build on a solid foundation wall, which encourages people to rebuild and improve inside those solid walls out of sight of the building department. Think about enforcing V-zone standards in the coastal A zone. And everybody now is getting maps showing the limit of moderate wave action. Pick a line inland from the V-zone boundary and enforce the V-zone protection levels in there, protecting the properties from wave action in addition to water. And look at zoning. If you know you got a high hazard area, why are you allowing buildings there in the first place? You set aside areas for parks and for other purposes. Zoning and comprehensive plans can do that too. All of the things I mentioned are eligible for credit under the community rating system. And if you're not familiar with the CRS, tell us, and maybe we can do another webinar on the community rating system. But that gives you an incentive through reduced flood insurance premiums to adopt these higher standards, above and beyond the incentive that individual property owners will save a lot of money on their insurance premiums. So what did Conway do? This is from the Conway's planning work. The shaded area is what the official FEMA map said was where the 100-year floodplain goes. The asterisks is every property that had more than 2 feet of water over the first floor during the Hurricane Floyd flood. So you can see the maps don't always accurately predict where the water is going to go. And so Conway could have done the minimum, which was say, everybody in the floodplain, you got to follow the rules. Instead, they adopted a change that said everybody who got flooded is really in the floodplain. Doesn't matter what an old map says. This is what nature says. And therefore, everybody who got flooded will be subject to the rules. their rules already had on the books 1 foot of freeboard above the base flood elevation on their map. Obviously, this flood was higher than the base flood elevation on the map, so they also amended their ordinance to say anybody who got flooded must, who is substantially damaged or wants to build new, has to elevate the building 2 feet above this flood we just had, similar to using advisory base flood elevations. So Conway adopted higher standards right away before people started getting permits to rebuild. Step 3, you really want a public statement that says we're going to build back better. You want to reassure people that you know what you're doing, you're on a solid grounds, that you are got a good plan of what you're going to do next. So a formal public statement is very helpful at this stage. Tell people, listen, we really want to make things better. While you want to get back to normal, we want to improve our community. Here's the rules we have to follow. We do have a planning process. We are stopping and thinking before we automatically let everybody rebuild. But you understand that this will take some time. And we will work as fast as we can. We've got great people working on it. A variety of messages that you should include in the commitment. Conway passed a resolution soon after the water went down. They made it very clear that the city policy, as I mentioned earlier, is we're going to follow the rules. Nobody gets to rebuild or remove back into their house until the city has inspected it. We want to make sure it's safe and sound. And we will be developing a mitigation plan for the flooded areas, but at the same time we'll also be helping you as residents, keeping you posted, give you information on flood protection if you're interested in relocating or mitigating, where you can get financial assistance. We're not just sitting back and planning and leaving you out in the dark. I'd like to note that the resolution and all these other documents we're showing you are also on that website in Word, so that you can feel free to cut and paste them if you want to get a similar resolution or similar documents for your community. The resolution said now we're not just declaring our policy, we're going to implement it, and so we're going to make sure the building official inspects every building, and don't worry people, you're not going to be charged a fee for it. They created a planning committee, which I'll get into in a little bit. They charged the planning committee to, as quickly as possible, put together a post-flood mitigation plan. And they said, in the meantime, nobody gets to rebuild until we get this plan done. You can do some cleaning up and salvaging, but in certain areas, nobody can rebuild. So which areas should this take effect in? That is step 4, triage. Triage means split whatever population you're looking at into 3 groups. You need to separate areas that were substantially damaged or potentially substantially damaged from areas that obviously were not. So you can say, folks, you in this area, you're going to have to wait until we figure out what we're going to do, until our plan is done. Folks in that area, we know you're not damaged that badly, and you can go ahead and get permits to rebuild. How do you decide where those areas are? You should have some preliminary information right after the disaster called a preliminary damage assessment that's done by the emergency managers. You can do your own windshield survey. In Conway, they could easily tell with high water lines who had 2 feet of water or more. But eventually, you're going to have to do a building-by-building review. And FEMA has very good guidance and does workshops right after the disasters and makes staff and teams available to help come out to your community and do building-by-building substantial damage determinations. So when you triage and you've got that data of where's the worst hit areas, where's the areas that weren't hit bad at all, you want to have 3 categories. The first category of building is pretty clear they're pretty good shape. They didn't get much. They got water in the crawl space or in the lots. It doesn't look like they really suffered much damage. People can go ahead and make repairs. Don't forget you still need a permit to do it. Second category when you triage is this building is a goner. It is obviously substantially damaged. It's going to have to be rebuilt, elevated, or not rebuilt at all. If it is rebuilt, it's going to have to meet code. obviously substantially damaged. Some of these are real easy calls, but that brings you to the third category, and these could be, I'm not sure. You can't tell from the outside, can't tell from a wind seal survey. We're going to have to make a more thorough evaluation, probably with FEMA's substantial damage estimator. This is an example of such a building. It got a few feet of water. Can't tell if it's substantially damaged. Let's put it on hold for the time being till we can make a determination. In this particular case, that building doesn't look like it was so bad, but in fact it was damaged enough. It qualified for a FEMA mitigation grant and actually was elevated and mitigated after the flood. So questions on the third category is we need more time to decide which category you go into. So based on that information, you want to identify areas, not just building by building, but look at areas of the community and identify which ones do you want to target. Obviously, if you've got a lot of Category B and C buildings, the obviously substantially damaged and maybe substantially damaged buildings, those are the ones you want to focus on for your redevelopment plans. Those are the ones that have the greatest potential to be cleared out or at least mitigated. So for those areas, you're going to need area plans. I don't know how many areas you would end up with. There should be some manageable number of properties, some obvious neighborhoods, similar located structures. But you need a little time. How much time depends, of course, on how big an area you got to cover and how many people you got. Meanwhile, you can tell people, we're not telling you can't do anything. You can go back to your house. You can, after it's been inspected, you can clean it up, you can salvage the contents, do what you can, but you should not put any kind of money, don't cash in your flood insurance claim and put a lot of money into repairing it because we haven't decided what we want to do with this neighborhood yet. We will work on that, give you that answer as quickly as possible. So in Conway, they did have one area that I showed you earlier where you had 2 feet of water over the first floor on a good number of buildings. So take that as a target area and not follow the map, but follow where the actual damage was. The city actually did put roadblocks up and did control access to the area, partly to make sure you didn't get out-of-towners who like to go into other people's homes and remove things, but also to control the residents and make sure they weren't spending the night in buildings that weren't approved for reoccupancy yet. Individual buildings were given substantial damage estimators. Conway was lucky in 2 ways. One, it had a relatively small area, as you can see. It wasn't like the whole town was hit. And it had help from the State Building Officials Association. They sent in building officials who were experienced building inspectors to help the Conway building official, and for 2 reasons. One, they wanted to help their friends, but they also wanted to train their own people so that their town would be ready and have experience in dealing with this. So they rotated people for about 1 week tour of duties, and Conway actually had a lot of folks helping them and were able to do all the evaluations within about a week and a half. And when they found problems, they red tagged the buildings. So as you're doing all of this, you don't want to keep your residents in the dark. You really want to get the residents involved. It's very important, as any planner will tell you, probably the hardest thing, but the most important thing to do in planning is involve the public. These are their properties, their homes, their neighborhoods. You can't just come back to them and summarily say, okay, it's been decided, you got to go. It's their future, it's their lives. They also can help the planning process. They know the area best. They know what folks were going to be doing in that area. They have the obvious ownership of their properties. It's their decision as to what they're going to do. And so you can't summarily impose some things on them if they aren't agreeing to it. Plus, there's a real benefit. Once you involve them in the process and they see what's going on, and obviously it's a good thing to do, they get convinced that it's a good thing to do, and they may well push for higher standards. They may well, when they repair their own properties, do it to a higher standard than the minimum requirements. And you want to work with whatever was already there. What is the concerns of the residents? Do they think they need more park space? Do they think they need better schools? Do they want to improve tourism? show them in this planning process how rebuilding better can support all of that. So the results of all of this are area plans. This is the stopping and thinking. What do you do when you stop and think? You come up with a plan. So those plans for each of those target areas would identify which areas, and maybe even down to which buildings, can be restored. And of course, hopefully, if they're substantially damaged, they will be restored to code, or even better, restored to higher standards. Which buildings you need to get rid of, and which areas should you clear and redevelop. The hazard's too great to really let buildings and properties stay developed there. In Conway, they had public meetings to involve the residents, keeping them posted. The resolution created a planning committee of residents and key city people, and noticed that the chair of the committee was a resident. It was also very good, I hate to say this, but it was good for the planning process that 2 council members were also floodplain residents and had been flooded. And so the powers that be were very interested in getting these decisions made, get the plan done, get things moving. They came out with an interim report. It was about 20 pages long, and this was done within 3 weeks of the flood. It was actually within 2 weeks of the planning process starting. Again, during those 2 to 3 weeks, the other steps were going on, including the building evaluations. As part of the process, they sent a questionnaire out to all residents, put them in public places, and got folks to tell them, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back to normal, or do you want to go back to a better condition? So all that information was put together in tables, including the results of the substantial damage estimators, and you can see they had some pretty heavily damaged properties. Also interesting to note that some of the worst hit properties were not in the FEMA mapped floodplain. Who had insurance, because that helps tell you, very, very important to tell you who's got some financial resources to fall back on to help pay for the mitigation. And a particular interesting thing was the answers to the question of, do you want to sell? And you can see that every one of the worst damaged properties, except for one who didn't respond, said, yeah, I'm interested in selling out. Some had been flooded before, some had not. So all of that information is very useful. Public involvement really reinforces what you really want to do, which is clear out the worst hit areas. Don't forget everybody else. Keep the public informed about what you're doing. People will support what you're doing, provided they understand the rules. They realize, okay, I've got a building code, I've got a flood insurance program rule, I'm going to have to be evaluated to see if I'm substantially damaged. But they also want to make sure that the mayor's house doesn't get missed, or that the rules don't seem fairly enforced. The guy across the street didn't have to do the same things you did. They will support the process when they know what's going on. How does the planning process work? Can they participate, have some input? Can they watch? Will somebody listen to them? All of those are key tools to get public involvement and public support. Also tell them what can they do on their own. There are things they can do, such as salvaging whatever they can in their properties. Do they know some of the tricks, like if they have an irreplaceable family portrait, do they know to wrap it in a plastic bag and put it in the freezer and worry about getting it repaired later? That's the kind of information to get out to folks. And can they mitigate things they could do, especially if they're not substantially damaged and it's completely their option. They may well want to elevate their house anyway once they see what the benefits are. I think I'd like to stress the point that once you have your folks educated, they're going to really be on your side, and they want to do more than is required. They will support the process. If they are substantially damaged, they are not going to fight you. They will pursue it and maybe even go to a higher standard. And if they're not substantially damaged, they may incorporate repairs and mitigation in their repairs. This is a great example where a community got flooded. It was not Conway. It was in the Midwest, but the community got flooded. This particular property is actually on FEMA's repetitive loss list. The community did an outreach effort to educate residents about mitigation. Afterwards, this property owner built this retaining wall around the low entry point into her property and has actually been flooded 3 times since then, at least as high as the previous floods, and has never had a claim since she built this. So this is a great example of voluntary mitigation, particularly in shallow flooding areas where the hazard isn't so bad that you got to clear buildings out entirely. So keeping the public informed needs an active outreach program. Your planning process, your whole effort should have some experts in public information, or at least people assigned to do that, through news releases. Get the word out to the residents. Don't just post it on a website and hope they'll find it. Get the handouts that explain what people can do. I say in plain English. I should also say in plain whatever language they speak in the target neighborhoods, which may not be English. FEMA is coming out with some really good, colorful handouts these days also to explain things like freeboard and advisory-based flood elevations. Make sure that your deliberations in the City Council and this planning committees are open to the public. People can attend. They can see. There's not any secret plots going on. Make sure folks have a chance to talk at these meetings. In Conway, they had a public meeting right at the beginning, even before the water was down, saying this is what we're going to do. They did that questionnaire I mentioned. Their planning committee meetings were publicized. They were held in the City Hall, and they were open to the public. They had a public meeting when the planning committee's draft was done, and most of the residents turned out for it, spent several hours walking people through the whole process, and then giving them at that time the printouts from the substantial damage estimator for everybody's property. Each person got to meet with somebody from the building inspection team and have that explained to them. Handouts, they did a variety of them during the process, and the first 2 are on the website. The one that advises property owners what should you be doing, what you can do during repairs. The other 2 are kind of out of date, so we didn't post them up there. But here's the one on advice to the property owners, real specific, saying you can go ahead and clean up, even if you haven't been inspected. Here's the kind of stuff you want to throw away. Here's some examples. There's a great book from the Red Cross that's also on our website on repairing flooded homes. Step 8, you're encouraging folks to do. It's your responsibility to make sure that people are fully repairing and rebuilding right. It's very easy for the mayor to say, well, everybody, we have a building code, but we're going to waive it right now. You're welcome to go back and fix up your house as fast as you can. You should not have any shortcuts to that, in particular because FEMA is watching over your shoulder. And if you're doing shortcuts and not requiring proper enforcement of the rules in the floodplain, you can get in trouble with the National Flood Insurance Program. No shortcuts to the health and safety standards. If you want to repair a flooded building, you really need to gut it. You really need to strip it of its flooring, of its drywall, of its insulation. You can't just go in and hose it out. And make sure your building officials understand what these criteria are. And make your substantial damage determinations. For gosh sakes, get it down in records. Keep records of what you found and itemize it. And be sure you have an appeal process. The substantial damage estimators are typically done from outside the building. Sometimes they go inside, but they obviously don't see everything. A property owner always needs to have a chance to say, you missed something, and therefore they have a chance to appeal it, especially where the substantial damage estimator comes up with something like a 51% damage. So that people need to know they're going to be treated fairly, and they always have a chance to rebut what the estimator produces. Step 9, do all you can to mitigate, even if it's not required. You want to encourage people and educate them. As you're repairing your buildings, there's lots of things you can do. You had a long, tall water heater that got flooded. You got to buy a new one. Replace your long, tall water heater with a short, squatty water heater and put it up on a pedestal above the water level, especially if it's sitting out in the garage. A lot of these encouragements are for properties that were not substantially damaged, but they can still reduce their losses. In Conway, we had a great example of a building that only got flooded an inch or two over the first floor, but the crawl space was flooded. And the ductwork was pretty well gutted. It had to all be pulled out, thrown away. So the property owner, not being substantially damaged, had the option of, well, I'm just going to repair it the same way it was. The property owner said, I don't want to go through this again. I've seen what things I can do, and they replaced their entire furnace and ductwork with a furnace and ductwork in the attic. Instead of in the crawl space where it was going to get wet, it was all repaired, had to be replaced anyway, and just replaced it in a different location above the water level. Lots of examples of these come after a flood. Lots of times local permit officials don't know about it because they're such minor things, but they are great ways to reduce losses. There's some various suggestions in the paper, but there's really good references from FEMA and others about what would be good mitigation measures for different situations. So we keep talking about planning this and planning that. The 9-step paper doesn't really get into how do you do a plan. It gets into how do you set up the framework so you've got some time to stop and think and do a plan. There are some good references on doing planning, mitigation planning. Natural Hazards Mitigation Association has a planning committee. We've got FEMA's websites and other references. So we're assuming that you know how to do the planning. It's just a question of building the framework, getting folks ready to buy into the fact that they're going to need a little time to get a plan done, and you can't rebuild immediately. So FEMA sites, and there are links, or will be links on our website to these planning references. Also want to put in a plug for the Patchwork Quilt, which is a Natural Hazards Mitigation Association publication also on our site that is very good. The biggest question, of course, when you do planning and come up with great ideas is how are you going to pay for it? And there's a tendency to only look at one program, like look at FEMA's and say, well, all we got is a FEMA grant to buy out properties, but people don't want to be bought out. They want to be redeveloped differently. There's not enough money or for this or that. So a Patchwork Quilt goes through a process that folks can follow to pick different resources from different programs, and has some good examples of communities that have done that. So money shouldn't keep you from implementing a good plan. Conway situation, I said they did an interim plan within 2 to 3 weeks of the flood. Then they took time to do a long-range master mitigation plan and came up with 21 action items, not just related to redevelopment or rebuilding, but how to make the community better with better maps, the better warning program, with better public information activities. And an example of that, this is one reason why I wanted to talk about Conway, is because it was, it was 13 years ago when Hurricane Floyd hit. You remember this map that showed buildings that were hit with at least 2 feet of water? The plan identified properties that really ought to go. And if you remember that questionnaire where so many people said, yes, I'm willing to relocate, that's the plan. And when you say, okay, that's a great plan, but what actually happened? Courtesy of Google Earth, we were able to see that same neighborhood, all but 3 properties have been cleared. I'm not sure why there are 3 holdouts or the whole story, but this is a really good track record if anybody's been in mitigation planning in terms of a voluntary program where people are asked to go, we find enough money, you find it soon enough that this many actually do clear out. And Conway now has a greenway, walking areas, lots of neat recreational opportunities along their waterfronts. So these steps have proven to work. I think Conway's a great example. I think a lot of folks on the call right now probably have similar examples. The key message is stop and think, do a plan, don't go back to normal. Think about the future. Think about the fact that the sea level's rising, floods can get worse, storms are coming more frequently. All the other stories you've heard, they're true. And so think about higher standards. Get the people who are going to be most effective, which are usually the residents of the area, involved. And the result comes up to be a better and safer community where people do things voluntarily. Some buildings are rebuilt to code, preferably to higher standards, and some areas are cleared out completely and not subject to damage in the future. So that information and the paper and the various links and references and Conway examples are all on the website, the Sandy website. And now we'll open up to questions, and let me ask Alessandra first if she's been looking at questions being submitted and any that we should answer first.
We have had questions about the PowerPoint, and which will be made available online and also emailed to all participants. A question that was posed earlier during the webinar: how do you figure out the value of a damaged building? Who does the substantial damage assessment? What if there are not enough assessors to go around?
Good question. So the last question first. What if there's not enough to go around? That's where the triage comes in. And you say, okay, we're going to focus our efforts where it looks like the third category. I don't need assessors when the building's not there. It's wiped off its foundation. I don't need assessors where it only got inches into the first floor. So we're going to put our effort concentrate our effort where we just don't know yet. If you don't have enough time, don't have enough people, obviously it's going to take you more time with the people you have, and that's why you need to sell them on the planning process and explain why they have to wait. Who does it? Officially, the determination is done by the local building department. So they enforce the building code, they enforce the floodplain rules. They're the people who do the official determination. After a disaster, FEMA has made available damage assessment teams, substantial damage estimating teams. I know there's teams going through New Jersey, but I also know they're still doing it because they've only got so many people themselves. So I would say if you want to know where to start, call FEMA, call the State Flood Insurance Coordinator's office, see if there is some support with training or even better, the teams themselves. You can develop your own shortcut versions. We've seen communities say, if you had 3 feet of water, you're going to be considered substantially damaged unless you prove to us otherwise. And that's a shortcut way to do it. It may not be as fair to the property owner, but it's one way to get answers more quickly than waiting for the full-fledged estimations. If you do use the FEMA system, the FEMA software, which takes on about a half an hour to an hour per property, remember it's just one technique. Your ordinance reads the cost to repair the property is more than 50% or more of the value of the building. So eventually you will need to know the cost to repair the property and the value of the building. You can get help on the value of the building from your tax records. You can tell the property owner you want a permit to rebuild, give me a contractor's estimate, and the substantial damage estimator is really a double check. Or you can talk to folks and say, you're obviously substantially damaged, here's the data we have, let's not talk about splitting hairs and deciding if this is worth $4,000 to replace or $3,500 to replace. Let's just talk about making your house safer and rebuilding it better. So I guess that's a long-winded answer to the question. So I better let you ask more questions now.
There's one more question that's been typed into the question panel, and that is, when will the new CRS manual be available?
Oh, I ask that myself every morning. It's at the Office of Management and Budget. We are hoping to have it out in the next couple of weeks. We've got the version ready to go. All it needs is to get the OMB number stamped on it, and then it'll be on a website. Anybody in the CRS will get a notice. But I've been saying that for several weeks and several months now. I think we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but it just hasn't happened yet.
At this time, there are no other questions typed into the question panel.
So folks, feel free to ask questions from the floor. I would like to ask anybody who's listening, if you have situations similar to Conway, especially more recent ones, using more modern techniques, using the current grant programs and stuff, it would be great if you could send us some information on it or send the plan, any follow-up reports. We'd love to put more examples on the site for folks. I personally am concerned that what we're doing right now is kind of late for Sandy, but we all know there's going to be another disaster somewhere else, and I'd like to have folks be ready for them with a better, with a more robust set of examples, and maybe revising the 9 points too.
I have a question.
Shoot.
What is your opinion of more mutual aid agreements being established between cities and municipalities for the loaning or borrowing of staff, as you had in the Conway situation, and that this would allow a more seamless system of local assistance based on regional, regional cooperation? But these are all pre-signed mutual aid agreements. Have you seen any increase in that, or any desire for this whole idea of mutual aid agreements being promoted as a mechanism to strengthen disaster recovery or risk reduction at a regional level?
I really think it ought to be done. It's needed. The South Carolina Association had some kind of existing policy, and I don't remember the details, but one of the problems is if you get something like a Sandy, you end up with all your neighbors hit by the same storm, and they're all overwhelmed. Everybody who knows coastal construction is affected, and folks inland might be able to help, but they may not have all the expertise. I think there is also the EMA, Emergency Management Assistance, a FEMA-funded program, and I just don't know the details, but it is a tool right now where states can help other states at the state level and send people to areas that are affected. And that probably warrants more research as to how it could be used for building officials. I would say, rather than wait for someone else to figure it out, talk to the various floodplain management associations and building official associations about setting something up in advance and see what kind of protocols you need. Communities are going to be worried about liability. Somebody else is coming in trying to enforce our ordinances or telling our residents what to do when they don't know our community and things like that. But there's ways you can get around that by using the out-of-towners as data gatherers and helpers, as long as the local building official has the final say on things.
In the New Zealand Christchurch case, there were 300 early responders, first responders came from Australia, and these are all law enforcement people, and they deputized them all as soon as at the airport when they arrived at the airport in order to help them with crowd control and logistics and other things. But the 300 Australians were deputized as New Zealand, law enforcement officials at the airport. It worked perfectly because they knew what to do, and but it got past this issue of liability and who can do what. So I think there are some. Actually, there's a lot of good international, examples and pieces to look to that might be useful here.
That's a really good thing to follow up on. I'm always worried about ad hoc stuff, and somebody thinks it's a great idea, and somebody has problems with it, and things just get stuck. Nothing moves. I've heard horror stories of people showing up with ambulances after Katrina and told to wait a week before they were actually used anywhere. I think the associations ought to just put that on their agenda, and maybe NHMA can help them with some examples and some possible language to encourage them.
There is a comment in the questions box following up on this, which states that mutual aid agreements are good and done in several states. For example, Florida has the Range Rovers, who are building officials, retired, semi-retired, and travel the state to assist on everyday issues for some communities.
Yeah, we ought to be, Alessandra ought to be doing some kind of collation of all of that and send out something for folks. Give them some
French.
ideas.
Ron.
Yeah. Hi, Ron.
You might want to give some thought to making it a 10-step planning process, because I think the thing that's missing here is pre-disaster mitigation planning of communities thinking about this stuff before it happens, and it's really difficult once the event occurs to get people to think about anything other than reestablishing the pre-disaster status quo as quickly as possible. And if the city council and people are not on board with all of this and have given some thought to how they're going to do this 9-step planning process, and that they are going to do the 9-step planning process, it's probably going to be very difficult to implement.
Yeah, my experiences have been where they had no pre-existing stuff, but certainly life would be much easier and quicker if you already had the mindset, you already had the advanced thinking of it, just like thinking ahead on mutual aid agreements. If your community is already attuned to hazard mitigation, and
that's supposed to be being done as part of FEMA's community recovery planning effort for the National Disaster Recovery Framework, but we haven't seen much being put out on the street, for example, and how this is done, and certainly no test cities, which I think they really should go out and test this out on a few cities first, and any pushing FEMA to do this would be important.
We always want FEMA to do this and that, but the key to success is the community's got to buy into it and want to do it. And hopefully one disaster will educate them like it did Tulsa to start running a program better tuned to the hazards they face. But, I like that idea, Ron, and I know there's lots of refinement that we could do to this whole thing, and maybe that's a worthy cause to have something more refined that before the next disaster that people can pick up and have a whole toolbox ready to help them.
Yeah, because there have been at least 2 drafts that I've seen of the community recovery planning guide that FEMA has been working on, but those drafts haven't reached a point of general distribution. So they're working on this. We just maybe we should be more supportive of them. I think this is a good thing. Not to ask them; they're already working on this. It's not new stuff. It's just sort of saying, people really, this is a good idea. So
there is another comment that has been made, which is that what they are doing in Florida with the post-disaster redevelopment planning activities is a great example of these activities. And I would also share that several of the Resilient Neighbors Network communities, and you can learn more about the Resilient Neighbors Network on the NHMA website, are engaging in efforts at pre-disaster recovery planning. But again, struggling with the same challenges that everybody's been bringing up.
One little tool to help do it is the community rating system, and the new manual, which people haven't seen, of course, has has credits for pre-disaster planning as part of their mitigation planning credit. So the word is getting out. There's different ways to promote it. It's still an uphill battle. Other questions or comments? All righty. Well, we appreciate everybody participating and joining us, and hopefully going forth and carrying the message on to others. If you want your CFM continuing education credit, please send an email in, and we'll get your name on the list. And you have the website in front of you for lots of resources. And any volunteers to help refine the thing or work on mutual aid, send your name in to Alessandra. Alessandra, you got any wrap-up commercials on NHMA? Or?
Just to say thank you to everybody for participating. Invite you to please do take a minute to do as French suggested and visit the website and see the resources. Also, we are always looking for best practice examples to both post on the website and share with the membership. And so some of the things that have been shared today, and if anyone has any follow-up items, they're always very much appreciated.